Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first ever Espresso English webinar. And the topic for today is on formal and informal English. I want to start by talking about why it's important to know about the differences between formal and informal English. So let me show you a picture and ask you a question. Would you wear this to a job interview? No? Why not? That's right, it's not appropriate, it's not formal. She's wearing little shorts that show her legs, and a sweatshirt, it's just not very professional, right? On the other hand, would you wear this to the gym or the beach? No, and why not? It's too hot, yeah. And it's too formal, it's not appropriate clothing. So, in the same way, using English that is too formal or too informal for the situation where you are can cause a bad impression. I want to talk about actually 3 levels of formality. It's not as simple as just formal and informal. The first level we have is formal English, and this type of English is mostly used in writing, and it's used in textbooks, official reports, academic articles, essays like the papers you might write for a university, business letters, contracts, and the only time formal English is really used in speaking is in official speeches, like if the president of a country is speaking or some other official event, usually where the speech is written out ahead of time and the person is just reading the speech. So this is where you use formal English. It's not really used in everyday interaction, okay? The next level is semi-formal English. Semi-formal English can be used in day-to-day interaction with colleagues and teachers. So you can use semi-formal English in professional situations, but in more of a day-to-day type of context, not a super formal official context. Semi-formal English is also used in popular magazines and books. And when I say popular, I mean magazines and books that regular people read, that are not necessarily official or academic. And we also use semi-formal English when talking with someone who's in a position of authority or someone who we respect. So you'll use semi-formal English when talking with your boss, for example, or talking with someone who you just met, or someone, for example, who's older than you. You want to respect them and speak with semi-formal English. And finally, we have informal English, and this is the English you can use in a very casual, relaxed situation like interacting with friends, and that can be when speaking or chatting online or sending email. All right, let's look at some of the specific differences between these 3 levels of English formality. I'm going to explain 5 characteristics of formal English along with some examples. Formal English uses longer and more complex sentences, and I've given a quick example. You might read a sentence like this in an academic article. Research has shown that learning a second language, in addition to leading to expanded career and social opportunities, can also expand the reasoning capability of the brain, although this finding is disputed by some scientists. Now, this is a really long sentence, and in less formal English, we might say the same idea like this. Learning another language can improve your career and social life. Some people also say it can make you smarter, but others disagree. So you can see that in formal English, we tend to have these longer sentences with lots of clauses. Proper punctuation is important. Constructing the sentence grammatically is very important. And these things are not as important when you're speaking. When we speak in an informal context, we tend to use shorter and less complex sentences. Another characteristic of formal English that you might have noticed from the previous example is that it uses larger and less common words. And here's an example. Let's imagine you're reading this in an economic report. The economy is currently quite robust. Nevertheless, some specialists predict an imminent recession. Now, here's another version of that sentence, which is less formal. The economy is very strong right now, but some specialists say we'll have a recession soon. Now, I've underlined the words that are different. You can see that in the more formal sentence we say currently, and in the less formal sentence we say right now. The words quite robust are also very formal, and those can be translated into the words very strong. That's the less formal equivalent. And then we have the words like predict and imminent, which translate to say we'll have. We have we will, which is talking about the future. That's the predict. And soon is the equivalent of imminent. Let's do a little exercise. On the left, I have a column of less formal words, and on the right, I have a column of more formal words. Take a moment to see if you can match each word on the less formal side with its more formal equivalent. You can write down the answers on a piece of paper, and then we'll go over them in the webinar. So I'll give you 1 minute to do that. Okay, ready to check your answers? The more formal word for help as a noun is assistance. So instead of saying thank you for your help, maybe you'll say thank you for your assistance. How about the more formal word for buy? Purchase. Yes, you could also use obtain, but that actually fits better with one of the other answers on the list. So instead of we would like to buy some products, perhaps you could say we would like to purchase some products. The more formal word for need? Require. So maybe instead of saying we need the shipment to be delivered by Friday, you could say we require delivery by Friday. What's the more formal word for get? Obtain. Yes, get has several different meanings in English, and some people say you should actually avoid all forms of get in formal English. And so one of the ways to make the word get more formal is obtain. There's another meaning for the word get, of course, which is receive. For example, if you get Christmas presents, you could say receive gifts instead of get a Christmas present. Okay, how about a more formal equivalent for next or later? Subsequently. Yes, you can say subsequently when talking about a sequence of events and talking about what came next or what came later. The more formal word for also or plus? Moreover. So moreover is usually used when talking about ideas and you want to add another idea or another fact. You can say moreover and then state your fact. You can also use in addition. That's also okay for more formal writing or speaking. Okay, we've just got two options left. What's the more formal word for whole? Entire. So instead of saying the whole company, the entire company. The more formal word for enough is sufficient. So instead of saying the department has enough money, you might say the department has sufficient funds. Sometimes people also use the word funds or resources instead of the word money. I've prepared a list of 50 of these words with the less formal word and the more formal word that you can download and check out the examples of how to make some of these simpler and less formal words into their longer and more formal equivalents. Okay? Let's move on. In formal English, we avoid phrasal verbs. To refresh your memory, phrasal verbs are 2-word or 3-word verbs, and it's usually a verb plus a preposition. For example, the price went up. Went up is a phrasal verb. So, what can you think of a single verb to replace went up? There are two possibilities I could think of. You could say the price rose or the price increased. Those words have the same meaning as went up, but in more formal English we should always use the single verb instead of the 2-word phrasal verb. Here's another example. The client asked for a contract. What's a single verb we could use instead of asked for? Very good. Requested. The client requested a contract. Here are 2 more examples. The problems have come back. What could we say instead of the phrasal verb come back? The best word is really returned. The problems have returned. And how about we will cut down on spending? Here we have a 3-word phrasal verb, cut down on. What can you think of to replace that phrasal verb? One option is reduce. We will reduce spending. You could also say lower spending. I think reduce is a little bit more formal. The 4th characteristic of formal English is that we avoid contractions. Contractions are these shortened words like I'm, your, can't, don't, wasn't, and it's. So here are 4 sentences. The shipment hasn't arrived. They're manufactured in China. He's the director of marketing. And we'd like to inform you. How can you write those sentences so that they don't use the contraction? Take a minute to write out the long form of each word. Okay, now check your answers. Instead of hasn't, we say the shipment has not arrived. Instead of they are manufactured in China. He is the director of marketing. And we would like to inform you. Okay, so always avoid contractions in formal English. Always write out the long form of the 2 words. Now, what about this phrase, the company's employees? Is this okay in formal English? What do you think? This is okay because companies is a possessive, not a contraction. It means the employees of the company, okay? So you can actually use either one. You can say the company's employees or the employees of the company. Both of these are okay to use in formal English because, again, it's not a contraction. It's a possessive. Some people say that you should always try to use of the, but sometimes there's situations where you might end up with a phrase that has multiple of the. For example, the terms of the client's contract. You don't really want to say the terms of the contract of the client. It starts to sound strange. So if you want to, in formal English, you can spell out of the, but try not to do it 2 times in the same phrase or 3 times in the same phrase. And finally, in formal English, we use no idioms, no slang, and no text speak, okay? And text speak is the is the shortened and abbreviated words that a lot of people use when chatting online or sending text messages on a cell phone. I'll show you some examples in a moment. So here's an idiom. The software is a piece of cake. Okay, a piece of cake is an idiomatic expression that means it's easy. So a couple of different ways to say it that don't use the idiom would be the software is quite user-friendly, or the software is extremely easy to use. So both of these would be better than a piece of cake because we don't want to use idioms in formal English. Avoid slang. For example, $1 million in profit. The word bucks is a slang word for dollars, so we can simply replace that with $1 million in profit. And here's an example of what I mean by text speak, okay? We have the expression, thanks and we look forward to meeting you. And you can see that in the first sentence, a number of words are abbreviated, and we have numbers in place of letters, and we have the letter U instead of the word you. That's completely unacceptable in formal English, and so always spell out the words completely, all right? And one other thing to avoid in formal English is abbreviated words like these. The info is incomplete. The results have arrived from the lab. Fruits and veggies. Do you guys know what these three words are short for? Information, laboratory, and vegetables. So again, there's some words that are abbreviated in everyday English. Vocabulary is another one. A lot of people say vocab, but in formal English you should always spell them out. Let's move on to semi-formal English. Again, semi-formal English is what you use when speaking in professional situations in day-to-day life. So interaction with your colleagues, emails to colleagues who you email a lot, and when talking with people who you respect or people who are in a position of some authority. Now, in semi-formal English, phrasal verbs and contractions are okay. So you can say, could you look over this report? The phrasal verb look over means to review something and check it for errors. Here's another phrasal verb. She came up with a great idea. Came up with means invented or created or thought of. So that's a phrasal verb that's common. And you can use contractions, especially when speaking. I'm available on Friday morning. The directors weren't happy. In fact, when speaking, native English speakers, whenever it's possible to use a contraction, we use a contraction. Okay? Now, there are hundreds of phrasal verbs in English, and if you want to learn the phrasal verbs, I highly recommend you take the phrasal verbs course at Espresso English. It's called Phrasal Verbs in Conversation, and it will teach you phrasal verbs in the context of dialogues, so it's easier to understand what they mean instead of just memorizing long lists of phrasal verbs. In semi-formal English, some idioms are okay, but still avoid slang and text speak. So here are a couple of idioms that you might hear in a professional situation. Someone might say, this project is on the back burner. On the back burner is an idiomatic expression that means something is not a high priority right now. And it comes from cooking. When you're cooking on a stove and you're cooking multiple things at the same time, and you put something on the back burner, which is farther away from you, it means that's something you're not actively working on at the moment. So it's something that's a less or a lower priority. Another phrase is, we're operating in the red. In the red means that you have negative money. You're spending more money than you're receiving. So the opposite is in the black. Every company wants to be in the black. But if you're in the red, it means your cash flow is negative. So some idioms are okay in semi-formal English, but you should avoid slang and text speak. Here are a couple of examples of semi-formal versus informal statements. So to make an invitation, If you're inviting your boss, you would say, would you like to join me for lunch? And if you're inviting your best friend, you might say, hey, want to grab a bite to eat? Hey is very informal. Wanna instead of would you like? And grab a bite to eat is an informal way to say, have something to eat or go out to get something to eat. When you greet someone, semi-formal English, you would say, hello, how are you? Or how are you doing? Or how are you today? And in informal English, you can say things like, what's up? Or, hey bro. Or, there are a ton of different informal greetings, but those wouldn't be appropriate to use with a teacher or a colleague. Here's another example of some slang. In semi-formal English, you could say, the conference was great, or you could say, I enjoyed the conference. In informal English, when you're talking to your brother or sister or best friend, you could say, it was awesome, or it was the bomb. The bomb is a very informal, it's a slang expression that means something was great, it was wonderful. But you probably want to avoid this in professional situations because it's slang. And again, no text speak whatsoever in semi-formal English. And the third point about semi-formal English is that you should use polite English. Now, what do I mean by polite English? Some English learners speak things a little bit too directly. And what do I mean by directly? Instead of saying I want, it's better to say I'd like. That's short for I would like. So instead of saying I want some information, that just sounds very rude, very direct. It's better to say I'd like some information, please. The addition of please also makes it more polite. Another example of polite English is when you're asking somebody else to do something. Don't give direct commands like call me later. That just sounds like you're giving the person an order. It's better to ask, could you please call me later? Or something like this. Can you or could you? And again, the addition of the word please makes the request much more polite, and this is good for your social relations. Another element of politeness in English is that we usually try to avoid, in English, saying negative things too directly. So for example, instead of just saying something like, you're wrong, that sounds very accusatory, like you're saying the other person is stupid. A better way to phrase it is, I'm afraid you're mistaken, or I'm not sure that's correct, or something like that. And when disagreeing or complaining or criticizing, instead of just saying, I disagree, you can say, I'm of a different opinion, or I see it differently. It's just a little more indirect and it's a little bit more diplomatic and polite. A couple more examples. When giving a criticism, instead of saying, this is terrible work, you could say, this could be improved. It's a little bit more focusing on the positive side, the potential for improvement, as opposed to just calling it terrible. And another example is, I don't like it. That's another statement that in semi-formal English we try to avoid. A couple of different options are, I don't really care for it. It's not my cup of tea. That's an idiomatic expression. It means it's not your favorite activity, or it's not what you like or enjoy. Or you could say, I'd prefer, and then say the alternative that you would like to see instead of the thing you didn't like. All right, let's continue and finish up with informal English. In informal English, we use shorter and simpler sentences, and perfect grammar is not as important. A lot of English students get really worried about making mistakes when they're speaking, but native English speakers, we make a lot of mistakes when we speak, and we don't construct correct sentences. I'm sure if you listen to this webinar again, you'll hear a number of things that I've said that are really not entirely correct if you were to put them in writing. But a couple of quick examples. Instead of saying, have you finished your work yet? Sometimes in informal situations, people will just say, finished your work yet? And just completely cut the auxiliary verb and the subject, you. Another example is, I'm really liking this book. Can anyone tell me what's not correct about that sentence? No, the word really is okay, but it's the word liking. Like is a state verb, not an action verb, and so verbs like, understand, know, those are usually not used in the continuous form. But in informal English, the rules are more flexible, and so people say things like, I'm really liking this book. And another example is, but I don't think so. Starting a sentence with but, ending sentences with prepositions, these are all acceptable in informal English. Another characteristic of informal English is that we use some informal expressions or exclamations. 4 very common ones are like, and let me see. These are all used for when you need to hesitate and you want to take a minute to collect your thoughts. I've said multiple times in this presentation, so you can see this in practice. And we have some other expressions like I mean, which is used to clarify, you know, which is used to check if the other person understands. Gotcha is used to say I understand. How come is another way to say why. Yeah, right. That's a sarcastic expression. It means that you don't believe the other person. And I'll say that's an exclamation that means you agree with the other person. And we have other interjections like wow for surprise, oops for accidents, yuck, that's when you see something disgusting, or oh man, which is when you see something annoying or something disappointing happens to you. And there are several hundred of these little expressions that you hear frequently in informal English, but oftentimes don't appear in textbooks. And if you take the Everyday English Speaking course at Espresso English, you'll learn a number of those expressions. In informal English, phrasal verbs, slang, and idioms are used very frequently. Here are a couple of examples. I won't put up with this. The word or the phrasal verb put up with means tolerate. So if you say I won't put up with this, it means I won't tolerate this. That's an example of a phrasal verb. Here's an example of an idiom. Could you give me a hand? Give me a hand means help me. It's usually used with physical tasks like carrying something or moving furniture, something like that. And here's an example of some slang. I aced the test. Aced means got a good grade on it. So these are just 3 simple examples, but there are, again, hundreds and hundreds of phrasal verbs, idioms, and slang expressions that you'll hear in informal English. And this is one reason that watching movies in English can be very challenging, even if you studied English for a long time. When you study textbook English, you can be very good at listening to news reports, listening to recorded English stories or articles, but when you watch a movie, you get all the dialogue and you have all this slang, all these idioms, all these phrasal verbs, and some of it you can get from the context, but a lot of it you won't understand. So it is important to learn these elements of English so that you can understand not only movies and TV shows, but also conversations with native speakers, because we use these expressions a lot. We don't even think about it, we just use them. And one final note is that when speaking, in both semi-formal and informal English, we use reductions. And reductions are things like this. He's gonna be angry. Gonna is a short form of going to. I want to learn how to ski. Wanna is a reduction of want to. When asking a question, did you like the movie? Didja is the way a lot of native English speakers pronounce did you. We have to leave now. Have to means have to. And even the word and gets shortened in spoken English. I bought apples and grapes. You can barely hear the word and. It just sounds like apples and grapes. Okay, so these things, we don't use them in writing, but we use them when speaking, and this can also make spoken English more difficult to understand. This is what makes spoken English sound fast, because oftentimes English learners try to pronounce every word very carefully and clearly, but native English speakers make the words go together and use these expressions like gonna, have to, and wanna. If you want to learn more, let me explain a little bit about 3 very useful English courses depending on what area you want to focus on. In the Business English course, this focuses on formal and semi-formal English, and you'll learn the phrases that you'll need for meetings, presentations, interviews, letters and emails, as well as some vocabulary. So if you're learning English for your job, whether you work with English speakers right now or if you hope to get a job at a multinational or English-speaking company in the future, the Business English course will be very useful for you to learn the specific vocabulary that you need for work. The Everyday English Speaking course focuses more on English in daily situations like restaurants, hotels, shopping, and socializing. And in this course, we really focus on phrases and on expressions that you don't often find in your textbook. So this is good for if you've studied English, you know the grammar pretty well, maybe you even have a good vocabulary, but you want to know how do native English speakers really say these things. The Everyday English Speaking course will help you there. And finally, the Phrasal Verbs in Conversation course will teach you phrasal verbs in context. You'll listen to a dialogue, and the dialogue will have a number of phrasal verbs in it, and this makes it easier to learn and to understand the phrasal verbs. It's better than just trying to memorize them. And in the course, there are also quizzes and writing exercises, so you can just put them into practice right away, and this helps you remember them and not forget them. Now, for all of these courses, when you register, you get access to the lessons online, and you can also download them to your computer, so you can study even if you don't have internet access. And there's no time limit, so the business course and the phrasal verbs course are 30 lessons, and the Everyday English course is 45 lessons, but you can take them at your own pace. You can do 5 lessons a day, you can do 1 lesson a day, you can do 1 lesson a week. It's completely up to you. And after you register, your access is permanent, so you can study anytime now or in the future. If all of these courses sound good to you and you can't decide which one to take, or you want to take 2 or 3 courses, just send me an email and I'll give you a discount if you want to buy 2 or 3 courses together. Okay, we're just about out of time today. So if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email me. My email is help@espressoenglish.net. And thanks so much for attending the webinar. Hope to see you next month. Bye-bye.